tonight we've invited Ellen MacArthur, Dame Ellen MacArthur, to come and talk to us. I first, obviously I noticed that somebody seemed to be very good at sailing around the world, far better than anybody else, and beat the French, which seemed to be a very important thing to do. And Dame Ellen made her name in that way, and I never forget watching the TV footage of her arriving back in Victory and the flares running, and I thought that was a tremendous thing to do. And then a little while later, I heard about the Dame Ellen MacArthur Trust offering sail training experiences for young people who've been treated for cancer. And as a cancer specialist, I thought, that's interesting. And I've been involved in doing some research in this related field and how you help people get over the experience. And we started, Frank Fletcher, who's here today, came and visited us in Nottingham several years ago and told us about the trust. And I started talking to the young people as they were recovering and saying, have you ever thought about doing something different? And some of them wanted to go and do sail training. Some of them went to some of the other quality camps that there are around the country. And what I noticed was that they went away being people who had often had a very difficult time, and they came back with their parents saying, I don't know what they've done to them, but it's changed their lives. And so I got invited to go and take part in sailing with the Ellen MacArthur Trust. Really, I went as an academic to say, well, what is it that's happening here? And I can't really tell you the answer to that, but I do think there's a need to find out what's happening, because it certainly is happening. And it was really the inspiration of Ellen that made this happen, and that's what the Trust is about. So we're going to hear from Ellen today about her sailing experiences and where it's taken her on her journey. And so I present to you Dame Ellen MacArthur.
I'd like to believe that the reason people follow this race is that it shows that if in your mind you have a dream, you really can make it happen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ellen MacArthur!
First of all, thank you all for coming. And what I'd like to do over the next 50 minutes is take you through that video slightly more slowly. I'd like to talk about my life and take you on my journey, the journey really that brings me to be standing in front of you all today. Just to dispel the myth that Ellen MacArthur only ever sails on ocean racing trimarans, here's a picture of me on a recent holiday with Floss the dog on the canals. And actually that holiday was a 300-mile trip. Obviously it would have to be some distance. But it was right around the Midlands, starting off from Shardlow just down the road, going right around the centre of the UK, back again to Shardlow. I need to get over this journey thing where I leave and end up in the same place. It's a recurring theme. So home for me was Derbyshire. It's where I grew up. It's where I spent the first 17 years of my life. But I was lucky, at the age of 4 years old, to experience sailing for the first time. My mum's sister, my Auntie Thea, she had a small boat on the southeast coast, and my nan, my brother and I went down to try sailing literally for the first time, and I shall never ever forget the feeling as we rowed out in a little dinghy to meet this boat, this little boat that my auntie had renovated. And I climbed on board, and I will never forget feeling that when we hoisted those triangles of cloth, that boat could take us anywhere in the world. And I couldn't get that out of my mind. And so at the age of 4, I was passionate about sailing. None of my friends at school sailed. I was the kid who sat in the library reading sailing books. But I absolutely loved it. There was something about it to which I was drawn to. And so from the age of 8, I started saving all my money for a boat. And when I went to secondary school and I had charge of my dinner money, I used to save the whole lot, apart from 4p for mash, 4p for beans, and the free gravy. Every night, coming back from school, I would put this little pile of change on the top of my money box, and then when that little pile got to £1, I used to cross off one of the 100 squares I'd drawn on a piece of graph paper. And when finally I made it to £100, I would take that cash down to the Building Society to put in. And that's how I saved for my first boat. This is me in the garden. The downside was that once I'd managed to afford a boat, I couldn't afford to put on a reservoir for sailor. So I dreamt, and I dreamt, and I dreamt of sailing. Every summer, we'd still go to the East Coast to sail with my Auntie Thea, but for just 1 week. And the rest of the year I had to make do with learning from books and learning as much as I could about adventures of other people. And those adventures were incredible. I'd been fascinated by the freedom of the sea as a small child. But when you read about people who've gone around the world, who've gone non-stop around the world, Sir Robert Knox-Johnson, the first person ever to sail non-stop solo around the world, that absolutely fascinated me. And I read his book time and time again. So the world for me was this incredible adventure playground. For me it was as big as you could ever imagine. It was the most incredible place you could imagine, and 2/3 of it was covered with ocean. And for me as a child, that really was the draw. I just wanted to go and experience the world. I wanted to see the world using the power of the wind, harnessing the power of nature to take that boat wherever the wind would take me. And so when I left school at 17, I decided that sailing was something which was going to be my life. And I had a difficult period at school. I'd always thought I would go to university. And I'll talk about my nan in this presentation, who went to university in her 70s, amazing lady. But I always thought I'd go to university, and when I was at school, I thought, I love animals. The one thing I could see myself doing was veterinary science. So I went through school, work experience was going to a vet, and I continued that on every weekend for 3 years. Going to a vet's every Saturday, I'd go and get experience, go out on call, go to the farms. I absolutely loved it, because I never thought sailing could be a job. And I got to my A-levels, and I was advised not to make an application to university, despite the fact that my predicted grades were AB, BC, BC, which was A, BB top grade. And those of you who've gone through medical science know that you need very high grades. But despite 3 years of weekends at the vets, they said, don't bother, Ellen, you're not clever enough, don't make an application. And so I didn't apply. I took a year. I decided to take a year out, but I thought I will give the best shot I can to get these A-levels, and maybe I'll get the grades, and maybe I'll just go a year late to university. So I worked and worked and worked. And during that period of working and working and working, I developed glandular fever. And I knew I was going to be ill. I knew when I got home I wasn't ill, but my glands were swollen, and I said to Mum, I know I'm going to go down with glandular fever, and I did. It was one of those gut reactions. And I spent a month lying on the sofa. I didn't have the energy to go upstairs to go to the loo. I was really struggling. It's a horrible thing to go through. But it did one of the best things that could have happened in my life, is it made me stop and think. And it was during that time I was lying on the sofa that I borrowed my nan's video recorder and recorded a program about the Whitbread Round the World race that was on at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I lay there on the sofa and I watched these images of people sailing out around the world, and I thought, I'm going to do that. I had no sailing experience other than 1 week with my auntie every summer, but I had a dream. And so when I left school, just 4 or 5 months later, after having gone back to take the exams, I went to try and be a sailing instructor on the northeast coast of England. And I slept on the floor of the sailing school, I worked on a boat for peanuts, and I made sure I got the qualifications that I needed to be able to teach. And the school there were fantastic. They took me on, they let me work for my courses, I cleaned the boats, I looked after them, I helped wherever I could. And suddenly for me, sailing was real. Sailing was something I was doing for my living, a very, very small living, but I was there on the water and I absolutely loved it. Suddenly, that dream, the doors opened, and it made me see much, much further afield. And that year was incredible for me. It was a year in which I decided that my first journey solo would be to try and sail around Britain. Now, around Britain's about 2,000 miles, and if any of you have ever done any sailing, you'll know that actually the shore is often the most dangerous place, because there's not a lot to hit in the middle of the ocean, but there's an awful lot of rocks right around our coast. But whilst I was working at the sailing school, I decided that I was going to try and sail solo around Britain, and this was the third boat I managed to buy with my school dinner money change. She was a wreck in a boatyard. She'd been abandoned for years and years and years. She came from Chesterfield, actually. Boat sales in Chesterfield. And I got her back to my mum and dad's. Then when I got to the sailing school, I was working at the sailing school. I had some money. I saved some money to do some work on her, to repair her, to change her rigging. And so I managed to get her up to the sailing school, and I worked on her there. And on the 1st of June, 1995, for the first time ever in my life, I sailed solo, and I was about to sail 2,000 miles around Great Britain. And I'll never, ever forget that feeling, standing there on the dockside, saying goodbye to everyone, climbing into the boat, going through the lock gates, massive tides on the River Humber, big commercial river, wide river, brown water, going out to the lock, going out into the river. And all this furore of leaving, all this excitement, emotion of saying goodbye to everyone, went quiet. It was behind me. And ahead of me was this huge, great big river. And I had this incredible feeling that behind, on the dockside, was my past. Out of that river, over that horizon, was my future. And there I was, for a brief moment, suspended between the past and the future. It felt like it was the first day of the rest of my life. And that's exactly what I did to make that all happen. This is my dog, Mac, saying goodbye. Love that photo. She knew. And that was sailing around Great Britain on Iduna. And for me, I was 18 years old when I left, 19 when I came back at the end of the summer. But it was the most incredible experience, because I proved to myself that I could do it. I proved to myself that actually I could get around the coast. I learnt on the way. I had enough skills to go, but I learnt on the way. And the warmth that people showed me on that journey was incredible. There was no team following me. There was no one on land going to meet me at every stopover. The people I met were new to me, and it was the most incredible adventure to see the coast of Scotland, to go through the Caledonian Canal and see the massive mountains, to come out at sailing down the canal past Ben Nevis. It was just absolutely extraordinary. And I couldn't help but feel, as I sailed down the west coast of the UK, that if I hung a right, the first land I'd reach would be Canada or America. There was a whole ocean out there. And as a kid, I dreamt of crossing oceans, and that was something very firmly in my mind. So wanting to cross an ocean, realizing that Hull on the River Humber was probably not the mecca of sailing, I decided to move down to the south coast. I knew nobody there, had no friends, but I knew there was a place called Hamble where lots of people sailed. So I moved Iduna there. I was on her there for a year and a half, and in order to afford to stay there, I was painting little tiny pictures, miniatures. I used to paint and then sell for £30 each to people who were sailing around on boats. So that was how I afforded to live, but I realized if I needed to go and cross an ocean, if I needed to find funding to go and cross an ocean, I'd need a sponsor. And many people think that sailing around the world is the hardest thing, but one of the hardest things is finding the funding to make that happen. Because little Iduna was not going to take me around the world, and she wasn't going to take me across the Atlantic. So I moved up from Iduna. I rented a porter cabin where I could have a phone line, because when you're trying to raise funding and find a sponsor, you need to be able to call people. So I had a phone line in my porter cabin. It was £7 a week. I could stand up in my porter cabin, which was a novelty, because Iduna's cabin was only 4 feet high. And that porter cabin became my home for 18 months, and it was from that porter cabin that I raised funds to race in a race called the Mini Transat, which is a solo transatlantic race. Now, some was free equipment, some was a little bit of money, some people helped out I'd met along the way, I borrowed some money, but the race actually happened. And in 1997, I competed in my first solo race. Now, the following year, there was a race, another race called the Route de Rhum. The Mini Transat was in a tiny 21-foot boat, but this race, the Route de Rhum, was sailed by the best solo sailors in the world. Now, I knew I couldn't go in at the top with a big boat, but there was a second class, a 50-foot class, that I thought I had a chance of sailing in. And by hook or by crook, going into boardroom after writing 2,000 letters, I managed to go in to meet a guy called Jeff Mulcahy, who was the CEO of a company called Kingfisher. Now, in the UK, Kingfisher owned B&Q, they used to have Comet. It's basically a retailer. And I sat there in that boardroom, and there was absolutely no reason that they should sponsor me, apart from the fact I had a dream that I wanted to share with them. And I sat there and I told them about my dream to sail around the world. I told them about the dream to be out there on the ocean, to share that with them, to be there together, to make this happen together. And then right at the end of that meeting, I said there's a race in 6 months' time. For a fraction of the cost of the round the world, you could try it. You could see if it works for your company. And timing was perfect. They were in the process of buying a big company called Castorama in France, and they were seen as being this big British company going into France. And suddenly here was the French-speaking, or though quite bad at the time, I have to say, young person who wanted to race in this race, and that race worked for them. They said yes. And I can't ever explain that feeling when after writing those letters, after searching for years to find that funding, someone says yes. And that's the first step to that dream being a reality. And though I'd hardly sailed the boat I raced in that race because everything was so last minute, I won that race in the 50-foot class. But the most amazing experience was what happened after, when Kingfisher agreed, as a result of the success in that race, to sponsor me to sail around the world in the Vendée Globe. So imagine what it felt, having dreamt your whole life about sailing around the world, and then suddenly sitting in a design meeting with a bunch of designers and the funding to build what you firmly believe is the most beautiful Open 60 in the world. I could not believe I was living my life. I could not believe that I was the skipper of that incredible boat as I sailed her for the first time in Auckland Harbour. It was the most unbelievable experience. I sailed her halfway around the world in training because I was just so happy to be sailing on this incredible boat. And I set off on my first race just 10 days after finishing a sail halfway around the world in training. And it was a race called the Transat. And it's a race that goes from Plymouth in the UK over to America. Now, against me in this race were all the competitors who that winter I would be racing against around the world. They were the best solo sailors on the planet. Now, I'd never ever raced a 60-foot boat solo before, and no one had ever raced against Kingfisher. She'd only just come back from being built. And I crossed that start line a very, very nervous 23-year-old, and for 2 weeks crossing the Atlantic, I was absolutely petrified. I was nervous, actually, not frightened of the elements. I was nervous of failing, because so many people had put so much faith in me. We'd built this incredible boat, and here I was in my first race, the first chance I had to prove myself to people. And I won it. I won that first race, and not even I could believe that that really was the result. But it didn't half put a lot of pressure on me later on in the year. But there was something else that happened that year. And that was being invited to go and sail with a French charity. Now, the first person that we ever employed for this sailing project with Kingfisher was a French girl called Marine Crenne, and her brother had had leukemia. And Antoine said, would I go and sail with this charity in France that takes young people sailing who are suffering from and recovering from cancer and leukemia? And I said yes. I love sailing, and I thought going over to France, meeting young people would be a great experience, but I was really, really nervous. I'd never worked with young people before. I'd certainly never worked with young people who'd been through difficult situations medically before. But within 5 minutes of getting on that boat, I was having more fun than I'd had in a very long time. And that was what it was all about. It was about having fun. It was about doing something quite normal with young people who weren't different from other young people. They were just going through a very, very difficult period in their lives. And I absolutely loved that experience. We cruised around the French coast. We absolutely loved it. We laughed until we cried. And for me, that was something that actually changed my outlook. When I set off around the world that November, I thought about those young people, and a whole load of them came down from the hospitals in Paris, where I'd visited them after. They came down to come and see the start. And they designed their perfect colour scheme for Kingfisher. There was a competition amongst the hospitals in France, and I was there judging the competition just a few days before setting off around the world. And yes, I was nervous, but that was the most incredible thing to carry me along, and it made me realise just how very lucky I was to have the opportunity to be in that position about to go around the world. And the Vendée is a real mixture of emotions, because you desperately want to sail around the world. I dreamt about that all my life. But you're about to leave everything behind for 3.5 months. In the Vendée previous to the one I raced in 2000, in 1996, one guy never came home. 3 boats capsized in the Southern Ocean. 3 people got rescued. 2 by the Australian Navy, with a ship going down all the way from Australia. It's a very, very dangerous race. And nobody was more aware of that than my mum and dad. And that moment when I stood on the dockside saying goodbye to them for the last time, for me, I had to deal with it in a almost in a way where you just have to get on with it. All I had to do was focus on the start line. I had to focus on the start line, then the equator, then getting into the Southern Ocean. I knew that I couldn't let what was happening get to me. You can't start a race like that without getting emotional. Nobody can. But you have to hold it together and you have to get out there, because that's what I absolutely dreamt of. But they hadn't. And then when I was at sea, no matter what the weather threw at us, I had some control. They didn't. There is absolutely nothing that you can do from the land to help someone who's in the middle of an ocean. And in the Southern Ocean, to get help, to get off the boat, takes 5 days. There's no support boat that goes with you. There's no one going to pull you off. There is nobody there. Just a Navy ship that takes 5 days to get down from either South Africa, Australia, or New Zealand, or Chile, I suppose. So it is a long way, and it is in the middle of nowhere. And the thing at the start for me was just getting out there, but Mum and Dad, it was harder. And the time actually that it hit me was not then. It wasn't when I set off. It was afterwards. It was when I finished the Vendée Globe and I was sitting in an edit studio in BBC Wales making the documentary for the BBC. And I watched this not through my own eyes, but through the lens of a camera, which didn't turn away when I did. And I watched those images of me saying goodbye to Mum and Dad, and then me turn away, and the strength they showed in the look that they gave each other afterwards was just incredible. And it makes you realize how selfish you are to go off around the world, because it affects a lot more people than you and you alone. But it is an adventure. To see dolphins riding off the bow wave were absolutely amazing. It takes about 300 pictures to get one like that when they're actually out of the water. And there are risks. This is an iceberg, not the biggest I saw, but it was probably 30, 40 feet high, and I missed that by 20 feet. I was inside. I'd been at sea for about a month. We were entering the Southern Ocean. The temperature plummeted. It got very, very cold. The Southern Ocean is effectively the ocean that flows around Antarctica. So when you go around the world, you go down the Atlantic, and then you go right around the Southern Ocean, which is effectively going round Antarctica, and then you go back up the Atlantic again. And so when you go down into the Southern Ocean, where you'll spend over a month, the temperature does start to go down and the risks increase, because you're in the middle of the nowhere, you have huge gales, and you have icebergs. And I knew there was a risk, but normally in that area, no one sees icebergs. No other sailor in the race at that point saw an iceberg. And I was in the cabin. I'd just had a sleep. I woke up. I'd got the radar on because I knew that the seawater temperature was very low. And I looked at the radar screen. Nothing. I looked out the windows, and because it was so cold, they were covered in condensation. So I grabbed the little rag I kept at the seat, and I started to clean the windows. And as I dragged the rag over the port-hand window, the left-hand window, all I saw through the glass was a sheet of ice. And my heart was in my mouth, and I ran out as fast as I could, and I was literally waiting for the splitting, crunching, horrible sound of the boat breaking up around me, because that's what happens when you hit an iceberg at that speed, and it didn't happen. And you can see there just how close it was, because that dome, the big round bit is a satellite dome, is in the middle of the boat, and the thing behind is in the middle of the boat. So it was very, very close. And if I'd even passed the other side of the berg by 20 feet, I would have hit those big lumps of ice that were floating in the water. There were more icebergs. Later on in the Vendée, I saw 9 icebergs in one day, the biggest of which would be over 1 kilometre long. It's like seeing an island. I could have sailed Kingfisher into those caves. It was amazing and awe-inspiring to see, because they really are green and blue. They really are these vibrant colours. And the other thing when you see them is you think, no one else probably ever will see this iceberg, because it will melt away and disappear. I saw an island in the Southern Ocean called Marion Island. Tiny ocean in the middle of nowhere. It was a speck on a chart, and as I sailed up and passed just a mile from it, I saw it had the most magnificent green slopes, an albatross flying from the slopes. Albatross follow boats in the Southern Ocean, and their wingspan is 3.5 meters. So that is one albatross wing. And when they stand this tall. There was another experience in the Southern Ocean, and that was just passing the following island called the Kerguelen Islands. I didn't see them, but I passed to the north. And we'd had an amazing day with a bright blue sky, white clouds, sailing. We had 20 knots, then it built to 25, 30 knots of wind. I helmed Kingfisher. We were surfing down the waves at up to 30 knots. It was the most amazing sailing. And then the wind increased further. and it was time to change sails. And I went to the foredeck, and I was putting up a very small sail, and whilst I was right on the front of the boat, 50 feet away from where I could control her with the tillers, she went into a jibe. And for any of you who sail will mean that basically the whole big sail hanging off the mast flips over to the wrong side of the boat. And because she's a very high-performance race boat with a canting keel, a big lead keel which swings underneath, she went over on a side to 90 degrees. So in the Southern Ocean, over the Kerguelen Plateau with waves that were probably 50 feet, a kingfisher was lying flat on her side, and the only way I could get back to the cockpit to sort the mess out was by monkey barring along her stanchions, which are the vertical posts you would normally use to keep you in the boat. And I got back to the cockpit, and I sorted things out, and I managed to get her the right way up. But there was some damage. There was some damage in the fact that one of the battens which keeps the sail flat was stuck over the spreaders. And that basically meant I had to climb halfway up the mast in 50-foot seas, in a storm in the Southern Ocean, to pull the batten out to get the sail back down again. And it was a ludicrous thing to do, but it was the only way I could be safe, because if I didn't get that sail down, the sail would be torn apart and the boat would be blown over. So I set off on my climb, and I got all my gear together. It was so cold I could feel my hands almost bonding to the mast as I climbed. And I climbed and climbed and climbed, and I got halfway up. I was absolutely exhausted. It took me about an hour to get halfway up the mast. I was being thrown into the mast like I was clinging to a telegraph pole in an earthquake. It was the brutality of being thrown into the mast, flung at it, like it was trying to break every bone in your body. And I got to the spreader, and I managed to get the batten out through some miracle, I have no idea how. And then it came to coming back down again, and I'd forgotten a piece of equipment. I'd forgotten a piece of equipment with which I could get safely down. So I had to free climb back down the mast. Now I free climbed up, but I had something that slid, which if I let go, gripped. The only way I could get down was to take that off, move it down, and then put it back on again. And on the way down, just below the spreader, I was trying to get this fitting back on again, and we hit a wave, and I slammed into the mast. It twisted my wrist. I dropped the piece of kit, which then fell below me. It was still tied to me, but I couldn't get it. And so I, at that point, was swinging from one arm, which was in a loop of webbing on the front of the sail, and the force of the Southern Ocean was throwing me time and time and time against the mast. And I tried to get my foot into the sail so I could then reach down and get this piece of equipment, and I couldn't do it. And the shoulder pain got worse and worse, and I literally felt like it was going to get pulled out of its socket. And I had an image in my head that came like there was nothing else that mattered, and it was the image of those kids in hospital. And I said to myself, you cannot fall from this mast, because those kids are following you in hospital. And if something happened to you, they'd be really upset. And it was that thought that got me back down again. With no doubt. I remember it like it was yesterday. So the difficult times spin to amazing times, and that's what it's like going around the world. One day you're fighting for your life, hanging from a loop of rigging in the Southern Ocean, and then the next minute you see the most glorious sunset as you round Cape Horn. And then as we sailed up the Atlantic, I had some visitors, unexpected visitors. These are swallows we see flying around here. Not really seabirds, not what you expect to see at sea, but they flew onto the boat in the evening. And I remember them coming on board, and I was absolutely petrified I'd squashed them, because they're really small, very, very fragile. And at night, there's no floodlight on the boat, so you can see where you're going. So the birds flew onto the boat, and I went into the cabin checking the charts, and I almost fell over because these two birds flew in. They flew into the cabin. They sat on the chart table, I'm not joking, this far away from me, right on the edge of the chart table here, and then they had a little stretch, had a little preen. They put their heads under their wings, and the whole night they slept right next to the chart table. And during the night I had a snooze too, so I'd fall asleep right next to these little swallows, and I'd wake up, check, yes, they're still there. I'd go out, change a sail outside, come back in, they were still fast asleep. And then when it came light in the morning, up they got. They stood up, had a little fly around the cabin, stretched their wings, flew outside, and that was them perching on the back of the boat before flying home. And I always remember that the swallows arrive in Derbyshire about the time of my mum's birthday. And I always wondered if those swallows were going back home to the barn at home. So after this incredible adventure, the finish is incredible. I'd spent my whole life dreaming of sailing around the world. And then I'd done it. I'd done it. I'd gone around the world. And in a weird way, that dream that you've had for all those years has been your direction. It's like your compass. You always know what you're doing. You're going around the world. What are you doing, Ellen? I'm going around the world. Everything I was doing was finding funding, trying to raise the funding, trying to make it happen. And then suddenly, the moment you cross the finish line, that dream's gone. It's the weirdest experience. And I crossed the finish line, and the team jumped on board, and there was these incredible emotions flowing between us because I hadn't seen a soul for 3.5 months. And you share so much in those first moments when you look into somebody's eyes. And then we sailed up the channel. Now, the start and finish of this round-the-world race, the Vendée Globe, is in France. And the channel that you travel up to where you moor the boat, where you tie up the boat, is 1 mile long. And all the way up this 1 mile long channel were people, 350,000 people, all waving, cheering, screaming, shouting, holding up banners, firing off flares. And you feel like celebrating with them. It's like being in the middle of the party and standing there. You know, you want to join in, you want to be part of it. But it didn't feel like I was at the center. It felt like I was just joining in something else that was going on. And so I leapt up with the flares and I showed my elation. But half an hour after I stepped off the boat, it was a very different feeling. When I see my face in that photo, I see fear. I don't see happiness. I don't see fulfillment of sailing around the world. I see the fear of returning from a round-the-world race at 24 years old and a girl losing her anonymity. I never sailed around the world to be someone who was known or famous. I did it because I wanted to sail. It was the only way I could do it. The only way I could afford to sail around the world was to race it. We finished second in the Vendée Globe, and the media coverage was absolutely incredible. And I knew at that moment, I knew as I approached the finish, the interviews I was doing, they were going higher and higher up the chain. You were suddenly doing an interview with the main people at the Times, the Telegraph. You were on the front page of every newspaper when you finished that race. And yet all you crave is normality. And that's the last thing in the world that you can possibly have. And it took a lot of strength that year to come back and to be me, to show everyone actually I was still Ellen. I didn't change just because I'd sailed around the world. Just because I'd been on the front cover of a newspaper doesn't mean you turned into someone else. I was still Ellen. And in a way, there was a real negative to that. I was obviously over the moon to have finished my dream, to have completed it, to have got around the world. But that was a real shock, and it was unexpected to me because I'd never thought about those consequences. But there's a real positive to that as well. And it took me time to realize, if you have a voice, if you are someone who's known, then you can create things that were never possible before. And in 2003, we started the Ellen MacArthur Trust. We planned it in 2002, the year after the Vendée, and then our first sailing trip was 2003. Now, the Trust was set up to do exactly what those trips in France did, those trips when I'd sailed with our chaperon sans cap. It was to take young people suffering from cancer and leukemia sailing. And that first trip in 2003, I was so nervous. Is it going to be the same? Is everyone going to enjoy it? Are we going to have fun? And I think the photo says it all. It was absolutely extraordinary. It's the most amazing experience for me. And to have that happen here, and to have raised the funding to put it all together, to see those young people benefit so much, was just amazing. This was one girl who came on that trip. Her name was Maxine. And Maxine is probably one of the most sick young people we've taken on our trips. She had spine cancer. She'd had 2 vertebrae removed. She'd been through a pretty horrendous operation. When Maxine arrived on the boat, she arrived with her mum in a wheelchair. She had 2 sticks, and when she came onto the boat, she scrambled down the pontoon with her sticks. We helped her onto the boat gently, but there were a lot of tears. There were tears from Maxine, and there were tears from her mum. Because through the whole treatment of cancer, she'd never been away from her mum's side. So this was something big for Maxine, stepping into a different world. And at that moment, you say to yourself, is this the right thing to do? Is this really the right thing to do, to put a young person through this? Is this right? But within 24 hours, we knew it was right, because Maxine seemed to change. She started smiling. She started joking. You can see from the smile on her face, she was very happy. She took this photo on her own camera, herself, and she sent that to me back at the Trust afterwards, and her mother wrote a letter, and she wrote a letter. And that letter described just what the Trust had done for her. And in a way, I suppose it was helped by the fact that we'd already seen the effect that the Trust trip had on Maxine, because She was there for 4 days, and on the 4th day, we came back into the dock. And when her mum came to pick her up, she ran down the pontoon to her mum. And Maxine didn't need her sticks because she needed to walk with them. She used them for protection because she'd been somewhere else. When she was diagnosed with cancer, she went to a different place. She went into a bubble with her mum, as they explained in the letter. But actually, as her mum wrote, that trust strip was the light at the end of the tunnel. And from that moment, it just got bigger and bigger. So I knew, having been around the world and had the most incredible experience, that sailing was something that I just had to carry on and do. And before I'd even finished the Vendée Globe, I decided to do a race with a Frenchman called Alain Gauthier, which was in a crazy 60-foot trimaran. This is his boat. This is us both training on it. And it was a two-handed transatlantic race. So the same year I finished the Vendée, I was off doing this race across the Atlantic. And it gave me a taste for multi-hulls, and it gave me an idea of what I wanted to do in the future. And I decided that year, in 2001, less than 6 months from finishing the Vendée Globe, that I'd go around the world again as part of a 5-year plan. The first thing would be to race Kingfisher in my final race with her, the solo transatlantic race, the Route de Rome, which I won. I then set off on these 60-foot trimarans, doing more and more training, and at the end of this 5-year plan was to try and be the fastest person ever to sail solo around the world. Now, to do that, I needed to sail one of these boats, because they're much faster than Kingfisher. Kingfisher had a big lump of lead underneath her, 3 tons of lead, which if she got pushed over, would always bounce the right way up. These don't have that. They're lighter, they're faster. And the lightness leads to the speed. But there's a price to pay for the speed. And that is they're pretty lively characters to spend time on. This happened to this boat, and there were 11 people on board. There were also 11 people on that boat, and that's clearly not coming the right way up again. And if you look at the figures clinging to the net on the right-hand side, you'll see just how big the boats are. The water is a very, very long way beneath them. And I know that situation very well because I was on there. I was one of those 5 people. And we were sailing along the coast. We were doing a race down into the Mediterranean. 5 of us on board, 1 guy on the helm, 1 guy in the cockpit with the ropes. I was about to go on watch, and I was standing inside the boat, grabbing something to eat. And then I felt a tap as something hit one of the rudders. And 5 seconds later, our world went dark as the boat flung upside down, and the windows were covered in seawater. And you're totally disorientated. It's like this room now being thrown upside down. You'd all fall to the ceiling. You don't really think about that. That's what happened in the boat. We all fell on the roof. Water up to our knees. And it's actually the most frightened I've ever been at sea. Not because the boat capsized, but because one of my best friends was out there stuck under the water. There were only 4 of us inside, and on the boat there were 5. And I grabbed the knife I always had on my waist, and I charged out of the escape hatch window, the little window in the side, ran out onto those nets, running through the water, like when you're in a nightmare when your feet don't move and you're trying to run away from something. It felt like that. I was running through the water trying to find this person under the nets. And I couldn't find anything. And luckily he was on the other side of the boat. But because the boat was upside down, you couldn't talk across because you couldn't see over the middle hull. But it was a real reminder of just how dangerous multi-hulls are. This could happen to any multi-hull at any time. They are very, very flighty. They are light. And the stronger the wind gets, if you don't make the sail smaller, that will happen. And it literally only takes 5 seconds. So when I set off at the end of 2004 to try and be the fastest person solo around the world, the stakes were high, A, because I was on a multi-hull, but also for another reason. When I decided to take this challenge on, the fastest person ever solo non-stop around the world was 93 days. Whilst we were building B&Q, a Frenchman called Francis Voyon built another boat. He took another boat, a 90-foot boat, and he sailed that boat around the world in 71 days. And everyone said that's unbreakable. No one's ever going to break that record. He took 20 days, over 20 days, off the previous record. So the bar wasn't just high, it was very, very high. Now, sleep on a multi-hull is sporadic. I would sleep generally outside under the cuddy, not even inside the boat, and I'd have my waterproofs on and a fleece blanket over me. I think one thing that people don't realize is that when it goes dark at sea, nothing changes. The boat is still charging through the ocean. You're still going as fast as you can. You're still changing sails. You're still having rain clouds and squalls coming your way. Nothing changes. There's no pajama moment where you get your pajamas on, get your hot water bottle, grab your mug of Horlicks and climb into bed. It doesn't happen, and it won't happen for 2.5 months. It's absolutely relentless. It is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months on end. And not once can you let your brain switch off, because you're in something that's moving. And you're in something that's moving very fast, by definition, else you will not break the record. And the best analogy to use is, if you imagine driving a car, or even being in a car if you don't drive, and the car's doing 30 miles an hour, like you would round a town. It's not very stressful. You could talk to someone next to you. You probably, as a passenger, wouldn't be paying much attention to what was going on around you. If you were going down the same road at 60, everyone would be looking at the road, definitely the driver, and you'd be hanging onto that wheel pretty tight. 90 miles an hour, you'd really be holding onto the steering wheel. You'd feel the stress, your hands would be gripping tight, and you would be absolutely focused on the road ahead of you. Well, that's what it's like when you go fast in a multi-hull. The faster you go, the more stressful it is. And a multi-hull has no brakes, no headlights, no windscreen, and it is firing through the Southern Ocean at an average of often 20 knots. And when the freezing cold water hits you at 20 knots, you really know about it. The boat was 75 feet long, so she was 15 feet bigger than those boats you saw upside down or crashing. So a big, powerful boat. You can just about make me out at the back, that dark shape. So you get tired. Not the most flattering photo in the world. But it just shows how absolutely, utterly exhausted you are. Because you can only sleep when the weather lets you. If the wind is changeable and going up and down, the risk of flipping upside down is very, very, very high. You cannot switch off from that boat. You are at its beck and call, and it is at the beck and call of the weather all the time, day and night. And that's the thing that's hardest to communicate about this journey. It is totally and utterly non-stop. Non-stop in the physical sense, but also you can't switch your brain off at all. You manage everything you've got on board. I had one bag this big for every 7 days on board. I had a little gas bottle in every second bag. I had 13 rolls of kitchen roll as I went off around the world. I had 400 litres of diesel in a tank to charge my batteries. I ran the batteries every day. I ran the generator every day to keep the batteries topped up. If that battery had gone flat, 5 seconds later I would have been upside down because nothing would be steering the boat and she would just capsize. So you get very, very connected to everything that you have. This was making food. Freeze-dried food, everything's like pot noodles. Most of the labels come off so you don't actually know what you're eating anyway. Not that it makes a difference because they all taste the same. You boil the kettle. I knew exactly how many pumps of water to put in the kettle to make one freeze-dried meal and a cup of tea. You boil the kettle, you pour that into the freeze-dried meal, you wait 10 minutes and there's the meal. That's what you do 2-3 times a day, depending on whether you're in the equatorial areas eating cold stuff or in the Southern Ocean eating hot stuff. It's a cycle. But the funny thing is that at sea you never feel hungry. You eat because it's a fuel. You don't eat because you think, oh, I feel really hungry, I must just have that shepherd's pie that's in that packet. You eat for a fuel, and it's very interesting. When you step off the boat at the finish, it takes about at least a month to actually feel hungry again. Because food becomes a fuel, it's a necessity. It's not something that you feel like. So you don't get off the boat thinking, I'm desperate for a steak and chips. You actually think, it doesn't matter if I don't eat now, because what's going to happen? I just fall over in the street. I'm not going to fall off the boat and die. Very, very different way of seeing things. Your body starts to behave in a totally different way. You're living on adrenaline, you're tuned into the boat. I felt like I could control the boat in my sleep. I slept with the autopilot in my hand and the rope for the sails in the other. You're totally and utterly wired. I had problems with the engine. I don't know if any of you know much about engines, but it's a single-cylinder 10-horsepower diesel engine, and the piston rings, of which there were 3, on the cylinder all lined up, which meant that with every stroke of the engine, the oil from the sump, which lubricated the engine, was being thrown out of the exhaust. We didn't know that that was the cause of it at the time, but we did know we were using oil very quickly, and I did not have enough oil on board to get around the world. One silly little thing like that happens once in every 3 million engines happened at sea during around the world. And that's where the teamwork comes in, because I hadn't done this on my own. I'd worked with the most incredible team of people. And back at home on the Isle of Wight, they got a 10-horsepower engine, the same, and they ran it with the only lubricating fluid in it of rapeseed oil and olive oil, which is the only oil I had on board left, which was for my food, for energy. So I finished around the world with the only lubrication in that engine being olive oil and rapeseed oil. And though it smelt like a chip shop, it actually did a very good job. Just to give you an idea of where you sit, there's a tiny cabin. It's 2 meters by 2 meters. And this is the chart table seat. And it's a bit like being in the cockpit of an aeroplane. You've got all the instruments in front of you. You always turn everything off you're not using. But you have a computer that's recording the weather information. You're monitoring the sea temperature. You have a computer which has a chart on it so you can see where you are. You're communicating. You're sending back images. You're doing live TV interviews due to the satellite domes on the back. There's actually a lot to do. And people say, do you get bored at sea? There is not enough time to sleep. It really is incredible just how much there is to do, to repair the boat, to fix the boat, to make sure you're okay, to look after things, to check things. You're always monitoring, always looking, always checking, and always trying to work out what the next thing to break will be, because it will. It inevitably always breaks. Something will break, and it always makes your life that little bit harder. So the finish. You'd think that you cross the finish, and like the Vendée Globe, there's thousands of boats there. That wasn't the case. The finish for the round the world record was off the northwest tip of France. I crossed the finish line late at night. It was dark, hence the black slide. Couldn't see much apart from just one little light in the distance, which was the lighthouse which marked the south end of that line. And when I crossed that line, all I felt was relief. There was no euphoria, there was no sense of elation. I sat down on the floor, I put my head back on her cockpit side, and I just sighed. I felt relief because I no longer had to look at the wind speed, I no longer had to sleep with the ropes in my hands. We'd done it. The weather didn't matter anymore. Capsizing was not going to happen because we'd stopped. We pushed the boat into the wind. In that 1 second, everything changed. All your priorities changed. And I sat there for about half an hour on my own before the guys jumped on board who'd been on HMS 7, the Navy ship that was at the finish line. And there they were in the dark, in the night, with their yellow survival suits and their little glowing sticks in case they fell in the water. And they scrambled up over the back of the boat. And I cannot explain to you how amazing it felt to look into someone's eyes again and hug them. Because we'd been through so much as a team getting to the start line of that record. The last bit for me was that 2 months. That 2 months of being alone at sea. We'd broken the record, we all knew it, but that record felt like nothing until I could share it with people. And that night, after hugging each other and saying hello and sharing stories and all of this transmission of data, of messages, of happiness, after that I lay down on my bunk inside and I took my wellies off and I took my waterproofs off and I got in my sleeping bag and I fell asleep that night to the sound of laughter. And that sound was one of the most precious to me in the world. This photo was taken as we arrived off the coast of the UK as we were sailing into Falmouth, and for me that picture encapsulates everything that the record was. For me, the record wasn't one person on a boat on an ocean. It was a team of people that put something incredible together, that against all odds built the best boat in the world, designed the best boat in the world, and then I managed to get her around the world in one piece. We did it together. And it is our record, and for me it always will be. And that day in Falmouth was like a surreal moment in your life, to stand on the stage in front of thousands of people, to share what you've done for the first time with all those people. It was incredible. To me, it was humbling. Because you do kind of think, what is everyone doing in Falmouth in February? It's still winter. But what better to come home to than a trust trip and to see Maxine again? That puts everything in perspective. The photo that she'd given me before I went around the world was stuck to my chart table. And whenever things were difficult at sea, I would look at that photo and I would think of Maxine and I would think of her smile and everything she'd been through, and it put my whole life in perspective. And Joe, standing there helming a yacht. Never been on a boat before in his life. There he is, helming a yacht. And I know that many of you are involved in the medical profession and many have worked with people who've been suffering from cancer, but one thing I learned through working with the Trust was just how being ill like that affects different people. And I always thought it was the illness. I always thought it was recovering from the illness that was the hardest thing. But what seems to be the case is it's not so much the illness, because you can fight the illness. It's your confidence. Imagine what it's like to be 14 years old. You're going through school. Everything's fine. You're going to lessons with all your friends. You're wondering what you're going to take for your GCSEs. And then one day something's wrong with you, and you don't know what it is, and you go to the doctor, and you go to the hospital, and you're told you've got cancer. As Maxine said, my grandma died of cancer. I thought when you got cancer, you died. Not only are you not in school anymore, but you start your treatment. And then the treatment goes on and on and on, and bit by bit you go to school less and less. You become estranged from your friends because they don't understand what you're going through. Your whole family is living in a bubble because all that matters is getting you well again, getting you fixed. Then you go through your treatments and you come out the other side, and then you're told to go back to school and get on with your life. But actually your life is very different from the other young people that you're with. They don't understand what you've been through, and you've not been with them. And that seems to have a huge effect on young people's confidence. They've been ill. They've been in this difficult and different place. And what we do at the Trust is we try and pull things back together again. For the first time after Around the World, we tried a trip called Bradwell. Never done it before. It was an outdoor activities centre on the East Coast. And it has to be one of my most memorable moments with the Trust. About 30 young people went down, adults, although actually, to be honest, there wasn't much difference between the adults and the young people, because we all jumped in the water, had a laugh, sailed boats, went in the canoes, did the high ropes. It was one of the most incredible experiences. I had not laughed so much in a very, very long time, and it just showed me how precious those moments are and how much fun can be had. It reminded me of being young. Here's Maxine again at Bradwell not long ago. And the Trust was building. The Trust trips in the summer were still going on, these 4-day trips that were changing young people's lives. We then did Bradwell, which was a 5-day activities week. Again, that was something different. It allowed young people, they came back, they met with each other, they met the friends they'd made on the yacht trips, either the year or the year before that. But we also did a lot of thinking as a team. Where would we take the Trust next? What would be the next thing that we should do? And when I'd been 18, I'd sailed around Britain. And for me, it had been the most incredible adventure. And we decided that we should try and take the Trust around Britain. And that's exactly what we did last year. We were lent a boat called Scarlet Oyster, and we left in May to sail her right around the country. To take those young people on that same adventure that I was so lucky to have aged 18, to see the mountains of Scotland, to see the open ocean, to watch whales leap out of the sea, and yes, they did, and I've never seen that in my life. And they saw that up the northeast coast, and I wish I'd been on board for that leg. It really was an incredible experience. On board the boats were smiles. It was so, so special. Really something quite different. And that picture for me says it all. So to finish, I'd just like to come back to inspiration, really. And this is very apt because I've come home. This is Nottingham, and I grew up just down the road. When I was a kid, I guess subconsciously I learned a message through my nan about carrying on in the face of adversity. Now, my nan was an incredible lady. She grew up in Bradford. She came from a very poor family. She always wanted to study. She always wanted to go to university. Perhaps that's why I thought at school I would always go to university myself. And when I was doing my, just coming up to my GCSEs, my nan decided that she was going to come to our school. And so she sat in my brother's GCSE German class, like you do. Come on the school bus in the morning, sit and have lunch with nan in the canteen, lunchtime. But as a kid, kind of what goes on is just normal. It didn't seem strange to me at all. Nan did GCSE German, then she went on to do A-level French, then she went on to do A-level German, and then she went to Derby University to do a degree in European languages. By the time she went to the university, she was in her 80s. And Nan, unlike no one else I'd ever met, she just wanted to get on with things normally. So during that degree, she went over to Germany for 6 months as an exchange student. You don't expect to get a letter from your nan saying that she was at a pizza party the night before. She had the most incredible experience. And she achieved her degree at the age of 83, and she'd had such an incredible impact on all the young people, well, everyone in the university, really, because she was a bit of a one-off, that they asked her to give the speech on behalf of all the students at the degree ceremony. And my nan had never stood up in public and given a speech before. It was all quite new to her, and she'd worked away with a little purple fibre-tip pen she always used. On this speech, she got it on a piece of paper. Her hat wouldn't stay on that day, so she went up without a hat, and one of the lenses of her spectacles fell out as she was walking up to the lectern. But luckily it was her bad eye, so she could still read through the other. And she stood there at the lectern, not dissimilar from me standing here today, and you could hear the pieces of paper crackling as she arranged them. And for 20 minutes she had the audience in the palm of her hand. She had a message she wished to communicate, and she did it so eloquently and so cleverly. She said in her speech, at the age of 80 I went to Germany for 6 months as an exchange student and scored. And then she paused, and then she said, but not in the way you think. She said, I scored because in Germany old people are respected. And the room fell silent. And I bet not one person in that room ever forgot that. And thinking back to Nan, who died just 3 months after that speech, because that's what she held on for. That's what she'd held on for all her life. I think about her like this, looking young and radiant, holding on to her degree. And I guess you don't really know who you learn from in your life. And you're not always aware of it at the time, but she was a huge inspiration to me because she showed real courage in the face of adversity, and she never, ever let go of her goal. Thank you.
That's extraordinary. Ellen, I don't quite know how to thank you for coming to Nottingham. I know it's close to your home, but it's been a feeling that we've had that we've always been a bit part of what you've done. I'm not going to ask anybody. We often at these lectures ask people to ask questions, but actually I don't think that would be an appropriate thing to do. What I have done is perhaps just put some pictures up. Would you like to sit down? And because Ellen's talked about her work with young people in the sailing, and there are a few of them on these pictures who are sitting in the front row here, and I thought instead of asking you all up there to ask Ellen questions, we might ask them if they'd come down and tell us about what this experience of sailing with Ellen MacArthur Trust was meant to them. And I've shown some pictures there of people. Perhaps you'd like to come up and just say your name. Perhaps Ben, do you want to come round and sit at the front, and perhaps we can give them a warm welcome. Perhaps you can see that from the black hole in the middle is there for a reason. Because I was on this trip, and there was an event. If you see here, we've got the person here on the left, Marie, had crutches at the time and is now training to be a nurse, and so seems to have got over her crutch needs. But she had a bit of difficulty with this fellow. And I just wonder, Marie, whether you'd like to talk about that. What was the problem with that fish?
Oh God, that's a really bad photo, isn't it? Well, the thing is, we said that they were going to go fishing when we were on the trip. I had no idea that we would actually catch something. I thought there was no chance, really. So I just contributed like everybody else. As you can see, we've got the little fishy thing in my hand. And then I actually felt something on the wire, and I was like, oh my gosh, what's this? And I shouted for help, and everyone pulled it out, and that fish came up, and someone said it was a sea bass. And I was just totally traumatised by it because I didn't expect to catch anything and I didn't want to kill something. So then I said, okay, I've caught something, can we put it back in the sea now? That's it, it's a bit of fun. And my skipper, Dan, there's a photo of him later, he got it and he bashed it over the head with a hammer and killed it. And I was really upset and I ended up walking off. I was a bit teary and Professor Walker came after me and just explained that everything dies and it's okay. And look, we'll eat it at the barbecue tomorrow.
So that was one event. Do any of these, Danielle, do any of these pictures remind you of anything you did?
Trying and not succeeding, obviously.
Tying the knots?
Yeah, just on this one here.
This is to get your level 1 RYA certificate, wasn't
Yes,
it?
but I got it in the end.
You got it in the end?
Yeah.
And what did you feel when you came back from the trip?
Well, when I had my treatment, I feel like lost loads of confidence. But just going, regain my confidence. And it was like a totally different experience. I was into ice skating and dancing. Never thought about saving in my life.
So it gave you a new experience you'd
Yeah,
never had
definitely.
before. Ben, you were involved in this. Tell us a bit about what it meant to you.
It was nice to see that other people going through the same thing like I was. Like I had cancer and other people from London, I think, who were from, at the time, they had cancer as well. So it was nice to share stories.
Do you have any comment? You put some of these slides together, is that right? Or Marie did that with you, or discussed it with you? Would anybody want to comment on any of the slides we've put together? What was happening here? Previous year. You thought it looked smart, did you? You were going quite fast if it was you. What's the next one here? Oh, Dan. Who liked Dan most? He was the fish murderer, was he? So this is a boat. Would you like to explain the boat to us, Alan?
Yeah, that's not actually the boat that the young people were sailing on. Although they might have quite enjoyed it. That was the boat that I took around the world. That was when she'd been repainted. And actually, I do remember it was that summer we took, I nicknamed her Moby, so she's always Moby to me. But we took Moby out of the marina for fireworks night, which is the last night of Cows Week. And one of the events that we do with the Trust is come and sail during Cows Week. And that night for the fireworks, we all piled on Moby. She's got these massive trampoline nets between the floats. And we had everyone from the Trust. There was Frank there with his kids. And it was one of the most amazing evenings. We just all sat there on the nets and watched the fireworks go off all together, just sitting there on Moby. And it kind of brought home just how special the Trust is. But for me, it was a very special moment because everyone was on the boat I'd sailed around the world on. I spent so much time alone on that boat that to have such a great, happy group of people on board just kind of brought her to life too. It's very, very special.
Kathy, do you have anything? What's happened to you since you've finished this sailing?
I think part of finishing the treatment and going to that trip was you kind of learn from, instead of being in a hospital bed for a year and a half where you're literally still and it's a routine, to actually getting up and doing things and doing something like sailing on a boat and learning new skills and meeting new people. It's just, it kind of sets you up to going back into normal life, I think. So it's well worth the experience, to be honest.
Did you have a lot of water fights during your particular trip, perhaps?
Yeah, there was another boat that was sailing along by, and it was quite hot, and we had some water bombs for some reason. And I think there was a hose pipe and there was a bit of a fight going on there, but that was quite fun as well in the middle of it all. And we, I don't know if there's any slides to it, but we also sailed out into the middle of, it was like this strip. And we,
The Solent.
yeah, we went and had a barbecue on there, and then that night we we went back to the boat and we slept on our boat. It was really warm. We just slept on top of the boat, and there was 2 shooting stars that we actually managed to see. It was a pretty good day. I won't ever forget that. It's lovely.
Rachel, what was your favourite part of the trust trip? What do you think you enjoyed the most?
Well, definitely the water fights, Frank. But that's exactly what it does feel like after staying in hospital for so long. You said it perfectly, it's just a bubble. To get out and actually do stuff like water fights and even losing miserably, might add, but it gives you so much confidence and you come home a totally different person.
Do you think it was the sailing, or do you think it was the environment you're in? Do you think it was the people, or do you think it was the fact you're on a boat, or what do you think was the most, the most special thing?
Everything, like being not in the hospital and like in the middle of the ocean with people who can relate to what you've been through and you can just have a laugh with and forget everything. That was the best thing. It was fantastic.
I'm going to come back to the fish briefly. Did you taste the fish?
What happened is we went to the barbecue, but they actually forgot to take it. So then we came back and ended up throwing it back in the sea anyway, so it was a waste, really, killing it in the first place.
What was your favourite part of the whole trip? Obviously, putting the fish aside. What was the best experience?
Best experience? I think all of it, really, getting to know people more, because Kathy and Danielle, we've become really close friends now. We see each other all the time out of hospital. And it gave me so much, I think. Before I went, I used to cling on to my mum all the time. She used to do everything for me. And when I went back home, I felt like I can do things for myself. And it was just amazing, so thank you.
So just to finish off, we often do a vote of thanks to the society, but actually I think the children have done the vote of thanks, or the young people have done the vote of thanks, because I think they've really said what your experience has done to them. And if it's done it to these 5 people, then it's probably done it to several hundred more. So thank you very much. All these people have had to go to the Medico-Chirurgical Society website and register to come here, and we asked them if they'd give a small donation in response to coming. And we pulled this cheque together, and this is the minimum amount that we've raised, which is £1,600. And there is a bucket outside the door.
Without a fish in it.
Without and there are about 250 of you here, and I suppose £2 each would make £500. So I don't think that's beyond you all, is it? Because that would take it over the £2,000 mark. And I don't think it would be it wouldn't be too much to ask. Do you think that would be right, Helen? So Tanya, you can get the bucket ready. Thank you very much indeed. You've done a wonderful job. It's been